Introductions to the Best British Short Stories of 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The Best British Short Stories of 1922 by Various. Introductions by John Cournos and Edward J. O'Brien. When Edward J. O'Brien asked me to cooperate with him in choosing each year's best English short stories to be published as a companion volume to his annual selection of the best American short stories, I had not realized that at the end of my arduous task, which has involved the reading of many hundreds of stories in the English magazines of an entire year, I should find myself asking the simple question, what is a short story? I do not suppose that 100 years ago such a question could have occurred to any one. Then all that a story was and could be was implied in the simple phrase, "Tell me a story." We all know what that means. How many stories published today would stand this simple if final test of being told by word of mouth? I doubt whether 50% would. Surely the universality of the printing press and the linotype machine have done something to alter the character of literature, just as the train and the telephone have done not a little to abolish polite correspondence. Most stories of today are to be read, not told. Hence great importance must be attached to the manner of writing. In some instances the whole effect of a modern tale is dependent on the manner of presentation. Henry James is, possibly, an extreme example. Has anyone ever attempted to tell a tale in the Henry James manner by word of mouth, even when the manner pretends to be conversational? I, for one, have yet to experience this pleasure, though I have listened to a good many able and experienced tale-tellers in my time. Now there is a great connection between the manner or method of a writer and the matter upon which he works his manner or method. Henry James was not an accident. Life, as he found it, was full of trivialities and polite surfaces, and a great deal of manner, style, if you like, is needful to give life and meaning to trivial things. And James was by no means an isolated phenomenon. In Russia, Chekhov was creating an artistic significance out of the uneventful lives of the petty bourgeoisie, whose hitherto small numbers had vastly increased with the advent of machinery and the industrialization of the country. As the villages became towns, the last vestiges of the romantic and heroic elements seemed to have departed from contemporary Russian literature. As widely divergent as the two writers were in their choice of materials and methods of expression, they yet met on common ground in their devotion to form, their painstaking perfecting of their expressions, and this tense effort alone was often enough the very life and soul of their adventure. They were like magicians creating marvels with the flimsiest of materials. They did not complain of the poverty of life, but as often as not created bricks without straw. Not for them Herman Melville's dictum to be found in Moby Dick, "To produce a mighty book you must choose a mighty theme." Roughly, then, there are two schools of creative literature, and round them there have grown up two schools of criticism. The one maintains that form is everything, that not only is perfect form essential, and interesting material non-essential, but that actually interesting material is a deterrent to perfect expression, inasmuch as material from life, inherently imaginative, fantastic, or romantic, is likely to make an author lazy and negligent, and cause him to throw his whole dependence on objective facts rather than on his ingenuity in creating an individual atmosphere and vibrant patterns of his own making. The other school maintains with equal emphasis that form is not enough, that it wants a real and exciting story, that where a man's materials are rich and big, the necessity for perfection is obviated, indeed, rough edges are a virtue. As one English novelist tersely put it to me, I don't care for the carving of orange pips. All I ask of a writer is that his stuff should be big. Undoubtedly, some people prefer a cultivated garden, others nature in all her wildness. Nature, it is true, may exercise no selection. Unfortunately, it is too often forgotten that she is all art in the wealth and minuteness of her detail. It seems to me that both theories are equally fallacious. I do not see how either can be wholly satisfying. There is no reason at all why a story should not contain both form and matter, a form, I should say, suited to the matter. Among the painters, Vermeer is admittedly perfect. Has then Rembrandt no art? Among the writers, Turgenev is perfect. George Moore has compared his perfection to that of the Greeks. Is it then justifiable to call Dostoevsky journalese, as some have called him? Indeed, it takes a great artist to write about great things, though, it is true, a great artist is often pardoned for lapses in style, where a minor artist can afford no such lapses. It was in such a light, with the true honesty and humility of a fine artist, that Flaubert, than whom none sought greater perfection, regarded himself before the towering Shakespeare. This preamble is no digression, but is quite pertinent to any consideration of the contemporary short story, for I must admit that however fallacious is either of the prevalent theories which I have outlined, in practice both work out with an appalling accuracy. Of the hundreds of stories which I have had to read, the number possessing a sense of form is relatively small, and of these only a few are rich in content. Strictly speaking, most of them stick to the facts of everyday life, to the intimate realities of urban and suburban existence. Other stories, and these are more numerous, possibly as a reaction and in response to the human craving for the fairy tale, are concerned with the most impossible adventure and fantastic unreality. Romance with the capital R. They are often attractive in plot, able in construction, happy in invention, and their general tendency may be to fall within the definition of life's little ironies. Yet, in spite of these admirable qualifications, the majority of these stories are unconvincing, lacking in balance, in plausibility, in that virtue which may be defined as the writer's imagination, whose lack is something more than careless writing. How often one puts down a story with the feeling that it would take little to make it a rattling good tale, but alas, that little is everything. A storyteller's craft depends not only on a sense of style, that is, form and good writing, but also on the creation of an atmosphere, shall we say hypnotic in effect, and capable of persuading the reader that he is a temporary inhabitant of the world the writer is describing, however remote in time or space that world may be from the world of the reader's own experience. And the more enlightened and culturally emotional the reader, the greater the power of seduction is a writer called upon to exercise. For it is obvious that all these hundreds of crude Arabian Nights tales and jungle tales and all sorts of tales of impossible adventure appearing in the pages of our periodicals would not be written if they were not in demand by the large public. The question arises, why is it that authors who deal with the intimate realities of our dull everyday life are on the whole so much better as writers than those who attempt to portray the more glamorous existence of the East, of the jungle, of, so to speak, other worlds? I have a theory of my own to offer in explanation, and it is this. A, let us say, is a writer who has stayed at home. Let us suppose that his experience has been largely limited to London, or still more precisely, to the East End of London. He has either lived or spent a great deal of time here, and without having actively participated in the lives of the natives and denizens of the district, has observed them to good purpose and saturated himself with their atmosphere. He has, in an intimate sense, secured not only his scene, but also, either actually or potentially, his characters. English, of a sort, is the language of his community, and the temper of this community, except in petty externals, is, after all, but little different from his own. He has lost no time in either travelling or in learning another's language. He has had a great deal of time for developing his technique. He has, indeed, spent the greater part of his time in working out his form. He is, as you may guess, anything but a superlative genius. Certainly we may venture to assume that he is, at all events, a fine talent, a careful observer, a painstaking worker, possessed of inventive powers within limitations. He knows his genre and his milieu, and he knows his job. He observes his people with an artistic sympathy. He is an etcher, loving his line rather than a photographer. Vast mural decorations are beyond him. Then there is B. B is a traveler, something of an adventurer, too. His Wanderlust, or possibly his occupation as a minor government official, journalist, or representative for some commercial firm, has taken him East. He has spent some time in Shanghai or Hong Kong, in Calcutta or Rangoon, in Tokyo or Nagasaki. He has lived chiefly in the foreign quarter, and occasionally sallied out to seek adventure in the native habitat. He has secured a smattering of the native tongue, and has even taken unto himself a temporary native wife. A bold man, he has, in his way, lived dangerously and intensely. He has, besides, heard men of his own race living in the quarter tell weird tales of romantic nature, perhaps of a white girl who came out East, or of a native girl who had won the heart of an Englishman to his undoing. At last B has had enough of it, and has come home to the old country, his England, and sits down to his new job, the exploitation of his knowledge and experience of the East. Possibly a few friends who had listened to his tales urged him to set them down on paper, and B, who had not thought of it before, thinks it is not such a bad idea, and getting a supply of paper and a typewriter, launches forth on a career as a writer. He is intent on turning out a good tale, and does remarkably well for a novice, but his inexperience as a writer, his lack of form and technique and deliberateness, will hinder his progress, though now and then he will turn out a tolerable tale by sheer accident. The really great man will, of course, break through the double barrier, and then you have a Conrad. That is to say, you have a man who has lived abundantly, and has been able to apply an abundance of art to his abundance of material. But that is indeed rare nowadays, and the whole moral of the little parable of A and B is that in our own time it is given but to few men to do both. The one has specialized in writing, the other in living. And the comparison may be applied, of course, to the two writers who have stayed at home, even in the same district. A hasn't much to say, but what he says well, because writing means to him something as a thing in itself. He finds compensation in the quality of his writings for his lack of rich material. The whole content of his art is in his form, and that, if not wholly satisfying, is surely no mean achievement. B, on the other hand, may have a great deal to say, and says it badly. He thinks his material will carry him through. He does not understand that the function of art is to crystallize, synthesize the materials at hand, to distill the essences of life, to formalize natural shapes. There should be no confusing of nature and art. A mountain is nature, a pyramid is art. We have no man in the short story today who has synthesized his age, who has thrown a light on the peculiar many-sided adventure of modernity, who has achieved a sense of universality. Maupassant came near to it in his own time. Never before have men had such opportunities for knowing the world. Never before has it been so easy to cover space. Our means of communication have never been so rapid. Yet there is an almost maddening contradiction in the fact that every man who writes is content in describing but a single facet of the great adventure of life. Our age is an age of specialization, and many a man spends a life in trying to visualize for us a fragment of existence in multitudinous variations. An empire may be said to stand for a universalizing tendency, yet the extraordinary fact about the mass of English stories today is that, far from being expressive of any tendency to unity, they are mostly concerned with presenting the specialized atmospheres of so many individual localities and vocations. We have writers who do not go beyond Dartmoor, or Park Lane, or the East End of London. We have writers of sea stories, jungle stories, detective stories, lost jewel stories, slum stories, and we have writers who seldom stray from the cricket field, or the prize ring, or Freudian complexes. Yet in putting on record these individual tendencies of the short story, I should be overdrawing the picture if I did not call attention to what general tendencies are in the ascendant. The supernatural element is prominent among these. Stories of ghosts, spiritualism, and reincarnation are becoming increasingly popular with authors, especially with the type I have described as A. This is interesting, since it evinces a healthy desire to get away from the banal facts of one's standardized atmosphere, the atmosphere of suburbia. It may be both a reaction and an escape, and may express a desire for a more spiritual life than is vouchsafed us. The love of adventure and the love of love will, of course, remain with us as long as men live and love a tale, and 9/10 of the stories still deal with the favored hero and the inevitable girl. This book is to be an annual venture, and its object is the same as that of Mr. O'Brien's annual selection of American stories. It is to gather and save from obscurity every year those tales by English authors which are published in English and American periodicals, and are worth preserving in permanent form. It is well known that short story writers in Anglo-Saxon countries have not the same chance of publishing their wares in book form as their more fortunate colleagues, the novelists. This prejudice against the publication of short stories in book form is not to be justified, and it does not exist on the Continent. Most of the fine fiction, for example, published in Russia since Chekhov made the form popular, took precisely the form of the short story. It is a good form, and should be encouraged. It is also the object of this volume to call attention to new writers who show promise, and to help to create a demand for their work by publishing their efforts side by side with those already accepted and established. It has been the custom to dedicate Mr. O'Brien's annual selection of American stories to some author who has distinguished himself in the particular year by his valuable contribution to the art of the short story. We propose to adopt it with regard to our English selections. We are glad of the opportunity to associate this year's collection with the name of Stacy Aumonier, As for the story selected for this volume, that is to some degree a matter of personal judgment. It is quite possible that other editors would in some instances have made a different choice. John Cournos. An additional word may be added on the principles which have governed our choice. We have set ourselves the task of disengaging the essential human qualities in our contemporary fiction, which, when chronicled conscientiously by our literary artists, may fairly be called a criticism of life. We are not at all interested in formulae, and organized criticism at its best would be nothing more than dead criticism, as all dogmatic interpretation of life is always dead. What has interested us, to the exclusion of other things, is the fresh living current which flows through the best British and Irish work, and the psychological and imaginative reality which writers have conferred upon it. No substance is of importance in fiction unless it is organic substance, that is to say, substance in which the pulse of life is beating. Inorganic fiction has been our curse in the past, and bids fair to remain so, unless we exercise much greater artistic discrimination than we display at present. The present record covers the period from July, 1921, to June, 1922, inclusive. During this period we have sought to select from the stories published in British and American periodicals those stories by British and Irish authors which have rendered life imaginatively in organic substance and artistic form. Substance is something achieved by the artist in every act of creation, rather than something already present, and accordingly a fact or a group of facts in a story only attains substantial embodiment when the artist's power of compelling imaginative persuasion transforms them into a living truth. The first test of a short story, therefore, in any qualitative analysis, is to report upon how vitally compelling the writer makes his selected facts or incidents. This test may be conveniently called the test of substance. But a second test is necessary if the story is to take rank above other stories. The true artist will seek to shape this living substance into the most beautiful and satisfying form by skilful selection and arrangement of his materials, and by the most direct and appealing presentation of it in portrayal and characterization. The short stories which we have examined in this study have fallen naturally into three groups. The first consists of those stories which fail, in our opinion, to survive both the test of substance and the test of form. These we have not chronicled. The second group includes such narratives as may lay convincing claim to further consideration, because each of them has survived in a measure both tests, the test of substance and the test of form. Stories included in this group are chronicled in the list which immediately follows the Roll of Honor. And finally, we have recorded the names of a smaller group of stories which possess, we believe, the distinction of uniting genuine substance and artistic form in a closely woven pattern with such sincerity that they are worthy of being reprinted. If all of these stories were republished, they would not occupy more space than 6 or 7 novels of average length. Our selection of them does not imply the critical belief that they are great stories. A year which produced one great story would be an exceptional one. It is simply to be taken as meaning that we have found the equivalent of 6 or 7 volumes worthy of republication among all the stories published during the period under consideration. These stories are listed in the special Roll of Honor. In compiling these lists, we have permitted no personal preference or prejudice to consciously influence our judgment. The general and particular results of our study will be found explained and carefully detailed in the supplementary part of the volume. Mr. Cournos has read the English periodicals, and I have read the American periodicals. We have then compared our judgments. Edward J. O'Brien. End of the introductions. Story 1 of the best British short stories of 1922. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The best British short stories of 1922 by Various. Story 1. Where was Wych Street? By Stacey Aumonier. From The Strand Magazine, 1921, and The Saturday Evening Post, 1922. In the public bar of the Wagtail, in Wapping, 4 men and a woman were drinking beer and discussing diseases. It was not a pretty subject, and the company was certainly not a handsome one. It was a dark November evening, and the dingy lighting of the bar seemed but to emphasize the bleak exterior. Drifts of fog and damp from without mingled with the smoke of shag. The sanded floor was kicked into a muddy morass not unlike the surface of the pavement. An old lady down the street had died from pneumonia the previous evening, and the event supplied a fruitful topic of conversation. The things that one could get! Everywhere were germs eager to destroy one. At any minute the symptoms might break out. And so one foregathered in a cheerful spot amidst friends, and drank forgetfulness. Prominent in this little group was Baldwin Meadows, a sallow-faced villain with battered features and prominent cheek-bones, his face cut and scarred by 100 fights. Ex-seaman, ex-boxer, ex-fish-porter. Indeed, to everyone's knowledge, ex-everything. No one knew how he lived. By his side lurched an enormous colored man, who went by the name of Harry Jones. Grinning above a tankard sat a pimply-faced young man who was known as the Agent. Silver rings adorned his fingers. He had no other name, and most emphatically no address. But he "arranged things" for people, and appeared to thrive upon it in a scrambling, fugitive manner. The other 2 people were Mr. and Mrs. Dawes. Mr. Dawes was an entirely negative person, but Mrs. Dawes shone by virtue of a high, whining, insistent voice, keyed to within half a note of hysteria. Then, at one point, the conversation suddenly took a peculiar turn. It came about through Mrs. Dawes, mentioning that her aunt, who died from eating tinned lobster, used to work in a corset shop on Wych Street. When she said that, the Agent, whose right eye appeared to survey the ceiling, whilst his left eye looked over the other side of his tankard, remarked, "Where was Wych Street, Ma?" "Lord!" exclaimed Mrs. Dawes. "Don't you know, dearie? You must be a young un, you must. Why, when I was a gal, every one knew Wych Street. It was just down there where they built the Kingsway, like." Baldwin Meadows cleared his throat and said, "Wych Street used to be a turnin' runnin' from Longacre into Wellington Street." "Oh, no, old boy," chipped in Mr. Dawes, who always treated the ex-man with great deference. "If you'll excuse me, Wych Street was a narrow lane in the back of the old Globe Theatre that used to pass by the church." "I know what I'm talkin' about," growled Meadows. Mrs. Dawes' high nasal whine broke in. "Hi, Mr. Booth, you used ter know yer way about. Where was Wych Street?" Mr. Booth, the proprietor, was polishing a tap. He looked up. "Wych Street? Yus, of course I knew Wych Street. Used to go there with some of the boys when I was Covent Garden way. It was at right angles to the Strand, just east of Wellington Street." "No, it warn't. It were alongside the Strand before you come to Wellington Street." The colored man took no part in the discussion, one street and one city being alike to him, provided he could obtain the material comforts dear to his heart. But the others carried it on with a certain amount of acerbity. Before any agreement had been arrived at, three other men entered the bar. The quick eye of Meadows recognized them at once as three of what was known at that time as the Gallows Ring. Every member of the Gallows Ring had done time, but they still carried on a lucrative industry devoted to blackmail, intimidation, shoplifting, and some of the clumsier recreations. Their leader, Ben Orming, had served 7 years for bashing a Chinaman down at Rotherhithe. The Gallows Ring was not popular in Wapping, for the reason that many of their depredations had been inflicted upon their own class. When Meadows and Harry Jones took it into their heads to do a little wild prancing, they took the trouble to go up into the West End. They considered the Gallows Ring an ungentlemanly set. Nevertheless, they always treated them with a certain external deference, an unpleasant crowd to quarrel with. Ben Orming ordered beer for the three of them, and they leant against the bar and whispered in sullen accents. Something had evidently miscarried with the ring. Mrs. Dawes continued to whine above the general drone of the bar. Suddenly she said, "Ben, you're a hot old devil, you are. We was just having a discussion like. Where was Wych Street?" Ben scowled at her, and she continued, "Some says it was one place, and some says it was another. I know where it was. Course my aunt, what died from blood p'ison after eating tinned lobster, used to work at a corset shop." "Yus," barked Ben, emphatically. "I know where Wych Street was. It was just sarth of the river afore you come to Waterloo Station." It was then that the colored man, who up to that point had taken no part in the discussion, thought fit to intervene. "Nope. You's all wrong, cap'n. Wych Street were alongside the church, way over where the Strand takes a side line up west." Ben turned on him fiercely. "What the blazes does a blankety nigger know about it? I've told you where Wych Street was." "Yus, and I know where it was," interposed Meadows. "You're both wrong. Wych Street was a turnin' runnin' from Long Acre into Wellington Street." "I didn't ask you what you thought," growled Ben. "Well, I suppose I've a right to an opinion?" "You always think you know everything, you do." "You can just keep your mouth shut." "It'd take more'n you to shut it." Mr. Booth thought it advisable at this juncture to bawl across the bar, "Now, gentlemen, no quarreling, please." The affair might have been subsided at that point, but for Mrs. Dawes. Her emotions over the death of the old lady in the street had been so stirred that she had been, almost unconsciously, drinking too much gin. She suddenly screamed out, "Don't you take no lip from him, Mr. Medders. The dirty, thieving devil. He always thinks he's going to come it over every one." She stood up threateningly, and one of Ben's supporters gave her a gentle push backwards. In 3 minutes the bar was in a complete state of pandemonium. The three members of the Gallows Ring fought 2 men and a woman, for Mr. Dawes merely stood in a corner and screamed out, "Don't! Don't!" Mrs. Dawes stabbed the man who had pushed her through the wrist with a hatpin. Meadows and Ben Orming closed on each other and fought savagely with the naked fists. A lucky blow early in the encounter sent Meadows reeling against the wall, with blood streaming down his temple. Then the colored man hurled a pewter tankard straight at Ben, and it hit him on the knuckles. The pain maddened him to a frenzy. His other supporter had immediately got to grips with Harry Jones, and picked up one of the high stools, and, seizing an opportunity, brought it down crash onto the colored man's skull. The whole affair was a matter of minutes. Mr. Booth was bawling out in the street. A whistle sounded. People were running in all directions. "Beat it! Beat it, for God's sake!" called the man who had been stabbed through the wrist. His face was very white, and he was obviously about to faint. Ben and the other man, whose name was Toller, dashed to the door. On the pavement there was a confused scramble. Blows were struck indiscriminately. Two policemen appeared. One was laid hors de combat by a kick on the kneecap from Toller. The two men fled into the darkness, followed by a hue and cry. Born and bred in the locality, they took every advantage of their knowledge. They tacked through alleys and raced down dark mews and clambered over walls. Fortunately for them, the people they passed, who might have tripped them up or aided in the pursuit, merely fled indoors. The people in Wapping are not always on the side of the pursuer. But the police held on. At last Ben and Toller slipped through the door of an empty house in Aztec Street, barely 10 yards ahead of their nearest pursuer. Blows rained on the door, but they slipped the bolts and then fell panting to the floor. When Ben could speak, he said, "If they cop us, it means swinging." "Was the nigger done in?" "I think so. But even if he wasn't, there was that other affair the night before last. The game's up." The ground floor rooms were shuttered and bolted, but they knew that the police would probably force the front door. At the back there was no escape, only a narrow stable yard where lanterns were already flashing. The roof only extended 30 yards either way, and the police would probably take possession of it. They made a round of the house, which was sketchily furnished. There was a loaf, a small piece of mutton, and a bottle of pickles, and, the most precious possession, 3 bottles of whiskey. Each man drank half a glass of neat whiskey. Then Ben said, "We'll be able to keep 'em quiet for a bit, anyway," and he went and fetched an old 12-bore gun and a case of cartridges. Toller was opposed to this last desperate resort, but Ben continued to murmur, "It means swinging, anyway." And thus began the notorious siege of Aztec Street. It lasted 3 days and 4 nights. You may remember that on forcing a panel of the front door, Sub-Inspector Wraith, of the 5th Division, was shot through the chest. The police then tried other methods. A hose was brought into play without effect. 2 policemen were killed and 4 wounded. The military was requisitioned. The street was picketed. Snipers occupied windows of the houses opposite. A distinguished member of the cabinet drove down in a motor car and directed operations in a top hat. It was the introduction of poison gas which was the ultimate cause of the downfall of the citadel. The body of Ben Orming was never found, but that of Toller was discovered near the front door with a bullet through his heart. The medical officer to the court pronounced that the man had been dead 3 days, but whether killed by a chance bullet from a sniper, or whether killed deliberately by his fellow criminal, was never revealed. For when the end came, Orming had apparently planned a final act of venom. It was known that in the basement a considerable quantity of petrol had been stored. The contents had probably been carefully distributed over the most inflammable materials in the top rooms. The fire broke out, as one witness described it, "almost like an explosion." Orming must have perished in this. The roof blazed up, and the sparks carried across the yard and started a stack of light lumber in the annex of Messrs. Morrow's piano factory. The factory and 2 blocks of tenement buildings were burnt to the ground. The estimated cost of the destruction was £180,000. The casualties amounted to 7 killed and 15 wounded. At the inquiry held under Chief Justice Pengammon, various odd, interesting facts were revealed. Mr. Lowes Parlby, the brilliant young K.C., distinguished himself by his searching cross-examination of many witnesses. At one point a certain Mrs. Dawes was put in the box. "Now," said Mr. Lowes Parlby, "I understand that in the evening in question Mrs. Dawes, you, and the victims, and these other people who have been mentioned, were all seated in the public bar of the Wagtail, enjoying its no doubt excellent hospitality, and indulging in friendly discussion. Is that so?" "Yes, sir." "Now, will you tell his lordship what you were discussing?" "Diseases, sir." "Diseases? And did the argument become acrimonious?" "Pardon?" "Was there a serious dispute about diseases?" "Oh, no, sir." "Well, what was the subject of the dispute?" "We was arguing as to where Wych Street was, sir." "What's that?" said his lordship. "The witness states, my lord, that they were arguing as to where Wych Street was." "Wych Street? Do you mean Wych?" "Yes, sir." "You mean the narrow old street that used to run across the site of what is now the Gaiety Theatre?" Mr. Lowes Parlby smiled in his most charming manner. "Yes, my lord, I believe the witness refers to the same street you mention, though, if I may be allowed to qualify your lordship's description of the locality, may I suggest that it was a little further east, at the side of the old Globe Theatre, which was adjacent to St. Martin's in the Strand. That is the street you were all arguing about, isn't it, Mrs. Dawes?" "Well, sir, my aunt, who died from eating tinned lobster, used to work at a corset shop. I ought to know." His lordship ignored the witness. He turned to the counsel rather peevishly. "Mr. Lowes Parlby, when I was your age I used to pass through Wych Street every day of my life. I did so for nearly 12 years. I think it hardly necessary for you to contradict me." The counsel bowed. It was not his place to dispute with a Chief Justice, although that Chief Justice be a hopeless old fool. But another eminent K.C., an elderly man with a tawny beard, rose in the body of the court and said, "If I may be allowed to interpose, your lordship, I also spent a great deal of my youth passing through Wych Street. I have gone into the matter, comparing past and present ordnance survey maps. If I am not mistaken, the street the witness was referring to began near the hoarding at the entrance to Kingsway and ended at the back of what is now the Aldwych Theatre." "Oh, no, Mr. Backer!" exclaimed Lowes Parlby. His lordship removed his glasses and snapped out, "The matter is entirely irrelevant to the case." It certainly was, but the brief passage of arms left an unpleasant tang of bitterness behind. It was observed that Mr. Lowes Parlby never again quite got the prehensile grip upon his cross-examination that he had shown in his treatment of the earlier witnesses. The colored man, Harry Jones, had died in hospital, but Mr. Booth, the proprietor of the Wagtail, Baldwin Meadows, Mr. Dawes, and the man who was stabbed in the wrist, all gave evidence of a rather nugatory character. Lowes Parlby could do nothing with it. The findings of this special inquiry do not concern us. It is sufficient to say that the witnesses already mentioned all returned to Wapping. The man who had received the thrust of a hat pin through his wrist did not think it advisable to take any action against Mrs. Dawes. He was pleasantly relieved to find that he was only required as a witness of an abortive discussion. In a few weeks' time the great Aztec Street siege remained only a romantic memory to the majority of Londoners. To Lowes Parlby the little dispute with Chief Justice Pengammon rankled unreasonably. It was annoying to be publicly snubbed for making a statement which you know to be absolutely true, and which you have even taken pains to verify. And Lowes Parlby was a young man accustomed to score. He made a point of looking everything up, of being prepared for an adversary thoroughly. He liked to give the appearance of knowing everything. The brilliant career just ahead of him at times dazzled him. He was one of the darlings of the gods. Everything came to Lowes Parlby. His father had distinguished himself at the bar before him, and had amassed a modest fortune. He was an only son. At Oxford he had carried off every possible degree. He was already being spoken of for very high political honours. But the most sparkling jewel in the crown of his successes was Lady Adela Charters, the daughter of Lord Fermeer, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. She was his fiancée, and it was considered the most brilliant match of the season. She was young and almost pretty, and Lord Fermeer was immensely wealthy and one of the most influential men in Great Britain. Such a combination was irresistible. There seemed to be nothing missing in the life of Francis Lowes Parlby, K.C. One of the most regular and absorbed spectators at the Aztec Street inquiry was old Stephen Garrett. Stephen Garrett held a unique but quite inconspicuous position in the legal world at that time. He was a friend of judges, a specialist at various abstruse legal rulings, a man of remarkable memory, and yet an amateur. He had never taken sick, never eaten the requisite dinners, never passed an examination in his life. But the law of evidence was meat and drink to him. He passed his life in the Temple, where he had chambers. Some of the most eminent counsel in the world would take his opinion, or come to him for advice. He was very old, very silent, and very absorbed. He attended every meeting of the Aztec Street inquiry, but from beginning to end he never volunteered an opinion. After the inquiry was over, he went and visited an old friend at the London Survey Office. He spent 2 mornings examining maps. After that he spent 2 mornings pottering about the Strand, Kingsway, and Aldwych. Then he worked out some careful calculations on a ruled chart. He entered the particulars in a little book, which he kept for purposes of that kind, and then retired to his chambers to study other matters. But before doing so he entered a little apothegm in another book. It was apparently a book in which he intended to compile a summary of his legal experiences. The sentence ran, "The basic trouble is that people make statements without sufficient data." Old Stephen need not have appeared in this story at all, except for the fact that he was present at the dinner at Lord Fermeer's, where a rather deplorable incident occurred, and you must acknowledge that in the circumstances it is useful to have such a valuable and efficient witness. Lord Fermeer was a competent, forceful man, a little quick-tempered and autocratic. He came from Lancashire, and before entering politics had made an enormous fortune out of borax, artificial manure, and starch. It was a small dinner party, with a motive behind it. His principal guest was Mr. Sandeman, the London agent of the Amir of Bakkan. Lord Fermeer was very anxious to impress Mr. Sandeman, and to be very friendly with him. The reasons will appear later. Mr. Sandeman was a self-confessed cosmopolitan. He spoke 7 languages, and professed to be equally at home in any capital in Europe. London had been his headquarters for over 20 years. Lord Fermyer also invited Mr. Arthur Toombs, a colleague in the Cabinet, his prospective son-in-law, Lowes Parlby, K.C., James Trolly, a very tame Socialist M.P., and Sir Henry and Lady Breed, the two latter being invited, not because Sir Henry was of any use, but because Lady Breed was a pretty and brilliant woman who might amuse his principal guest. The sixth guest was Stephen Garrett. The dinner was a great success. When the succession of courses eventually came to a stop, and the ladies had retired, Lord Fermyer conducted his male guests into another room for a 10-minute smoke before rejoining them. It was then that the unfortunate incident occurred. There was no love lost between Lowes Parlby and Mr. Sandeman. It is difficult to ascribe the real reason of their mutual animosity, but on the several occasions when they had met, there had invariably passed a certain sardonic by-play. They were both clever, both comparatively young, each a little suspect and jealous of the other. Moreover, it was said in some quarters that Mr. Sandeman had had intentions himself with regard to Lord Fermyer's daughter, that he had been on the point of a proposal when Lowes Parlby had butted in and forestalled him. Mr. Sandeman had dined well, and he was in the mood to dazzle with a display of his varied knowledge and experiences. The conversation drifted from a discussion of the rival claims of great cities to the slow, inevitable removal of old landmarks. There had been a slightly acrimonious disagreement between Lowes Parlby and Mr. Sandeman as to the claims of Budapest and Lisbon, and Mr. Sandeman had scored because he extracted from his rival a confession that, though he had spent 2 months in Budapest, he had only spent 2 days in Lisbon. Mr. Sandeman had lived for 4 years in either city. Lowes Parlby changed the subject abruptly. "Talking of landmarks," he said, "we had a queer point arise in that Aztec Street inquiry. The original dispute arose owing to a discussion between a crowd of people in a pub as to where Wych Street was." "I remember," said Lord Fermyer. "A perfectly absurd discussion. Why, I should have thought that any man over 40 would remember exactly where it was." "Where would you say it was, sir?" asked Lowes Parlby. "Why, to be sure, it ran from the corner of Chancery Lane and ended at the second turning after the Law Courts, going west." Lowes Parlby was about to reply, when Mr. Sandeman cleared his throat and said, in his supercilious, oily voice, "Excuse me, my lord. I know my Paris and Vienna and Lisbon, every brick and stone, but I look upon London as my home. I know my London even better. I have a perfectly clear recollection of Wych Street. When I was a student I used to visit there to buy books. It ran parallel to New Oxford Street on the south side, just between it and Lincoln's Inn Fields." There was something about this assertion that infuriated Lowes Parlby. In the first place, it was so hopelessly wrong and so insufferably asserted. In the second place, he was already smarting under the indignity of being shown up about Lisbon. And then there suddenly flashed through his mind the wretched incident when he had been publicly snubbed by Justice Pengammon, about the very same point, and he knew that he was right each time. Damn Wych Street! He turned on Mr. Sandeman. "Oh, nonsense! You may know something about these Eastern cities. You certainly know nothing about London, if you make a statement like that. Wych Street was a little further east of what is now the Gaiety Theatre. It used to run by the side of the old Globe Theatre, parallel to the Strand." The dark moustache of Mr. Sandeman shot upwards, revealing a narrow line of yellow teeth. He uttered a sound that was a mingling of contempt and derision. Then he drawled out, "Really? How wonderful to have such comprehensive knowledge." He laughed, and his small eyes fixed his rival. Lowes Parlby flushed a deep red. He gulped down half a glass of port and muttered just above a whisper, "Damned impudence!" Then, in the rudest manner he could display, he turned his back deliberately on Sandeman and walked out of the room. In the company of Adela he tried to forget the little contretemps. The whole thing was so absurd, so utterly undignified. As though he didn't know. It was the little accumulation of pin-pricks all arising out of that one argument. The result had suddenly goaded him to, well, being rude, to say the least of it. It wasn't that Sandeman mattered. To the devil with Sandeman. But what would his future father-in-law think? He had never before given way to any show of ill temper before him. He forced himself into a mood of rather fatuous jocularity. Adela was at her best in those moods. They would have lots of fun together in the days to come. Her almost pretty, not too clever face was dimpled with kittenish glee. Life was a tremendous rag to her. They were expecting Toccata, the famous opera singer. She had been engaged at a very high fee to come on from Covent Garden. Mr. Sandeman was very fond of music. Adela was laughing and discussing which was the most honourable position for the great Sandeman to occupy. There came to Lowes Parlby a sudden abrupt misgiving. What sort of wife would this be to him when they were not just fooling? He immediately dismissed the curious, furtive little stab of doubt. The splendid proportions of the room calmed his senses. A huge bowl of dark red roses quickened his perceptions. His career. The door opened. But it was not La Toccata. It was one of the household flunkies. Lowes Parlby turned again to his inamorata. "Excuse me, sir. His lordship says will you kindly go and see him in the library?" Lowes Parlby regarded the messenger, and his heart beat quickly. An uncontrollable presage of evil racked his nerve centres. Something had gone wrong. And yet the whole thing was so absurd, trivial. In a crisis well, he could always apologize. He smiled confidently at Adela and said, "Why, of course. With pleasure. Please excuse me, dear." He followed the impressive servant out of the room. His foot had barely touched the carpet of the library when he realized that his worst apprehensions were to be plumbed to the depths. For a moment he thought Lord Vermeer was alone, then he observed old Stephen Garrett, lying in an easy-chair in the corner like a piece of crumpled parchment. Lord Vermeer did not beat about the bush. When the door was closed he bawled out savagely, "What the devil have you done?" "Excuse me, sir. I'm afraid I don't understand. Is it Sandeman?" "Sandeman has gone." "Oh, I'm sorry." "Sorry? By God, I should think you might be sorry. You insulted him. My prospective son-in-law insulted him in my own house." "I'm awfully sorry. I didn't realize—" "Realize? Sit down, and don't assume for one moment that you continue to be my prospective son-in-law. Your insult was a most intolerable piece of effrontery. not only to him, but to me. But listen to me. Do you know that the government were on the verge of concluding a most far-reaching treaty with that man? Do you know that the position was just touch and go? The concessions we were prepared to make would have cost the state £30,000,000, and it would have been cheap. Do you hear that? It would have been cheap. Bakkan is one of the most vulnerable outposts of the empire. It is a terrible danger zone. If certain powers can usurp our authority, and mark you, the whole blamed place is already riddled with this new pernicious doctrine. You know what I mean. Before we know where we are, the whole East will be in a blaze. India, my God! This contract we were negotiating would have countered this outward thrust. And you blockhead, you come here and insult the man upon whose word the whole thing depends. I really can't see, sir, how I should know all this. You can't see it. But, you fool, you seemed to go out of your way. You insulted him about the merest quibble. In my house. He said he knew where Wych Street was. He was quite wrong. I corrected him. Wych Street? Wych Street be damned! If he said Wych Street was in the moon, you should have agreed with him. There was no call to act in the way you did. And you think of going into politics. The somewhat cynical inference of this remark went unnoticed. Lowes Parlby was too unnerved. He mumbled, "I'm very sorry." "I don't want your sorrow. I want something more practical." "What's that, sir?" "You will drive straight to Mr. Sandeman's, find him, and apologize. Tell him you find that he was right about Wych Street, after all. If you can't find him tonight, you must find him tomorrow morning. I give you till midday tomorrow. If by that time you have not offered a handsome apology to Mr. Sandeman, you do not enter this house again. You do not see my daughter again. Moreover, all the power I possess will be devoted to hounding you out of that profession you have dishonored. Now you can go." Dazed and shaken, Lowes Parlby drove back to his flat at Knightsbridge. Before acting, he must have time to think. Lord Vermeer had given him till tomorrow midday. Any apologizing that was done should be done after a night's reflection. The fundamental purposes of his being were to be tested. He knew that. He was at a great crossing. Some deep instinct within him was grossly outraged. Is it that a point comes when success demands that a man shall sell his soul? It was all so absurdly trivial, a mere argument about the position of a street that had ceased to exist. As Lord Vermeer said, what did it matter about Wych Street? Of course he should apologize. It would hurt horribly to do so, but would a man sacrifice everything on account of some footling argument about a street? In his own rooms, Lowes Parlby put on a dressing-gown, and, lighting a pipe, he sat before the fire. He would have given anything for companionship at such a moment. The right companionship. How lovely it would be to have a woman, just the right woman, to talk this all over with, some one who understood and sympathized. A sudden vision came to him of Adela's face grinning about the prospective visit of La Toccata, and again the low voice of misgiving whispered in his ears. Would Adela be just the right woman? In very truth, did he really love Adela? Or was it all a rag? Was life a rag, a game played by lawyers, politicians, and people." The fire burned low, but still he continued to sit thinking, his mind principally occupied with the dazzling visions of the future. It was past midnight when he suddenly muttered a low "Damn!" and walked to the bureau. He took up a pen and wrote: "Dear Mr. Sandeman, I must apologize for acting so rudely to you last night. It was quite unpardonable of me, especially as I since find, on going into the matter, that you were quite right about the position of Wych Street. I can't think how I made the mistake. Please forgive me. Yours cordially, Francis Lowes Parlby." Having written this, he sighed and went to bed. One might have imagined at that point that the matter was finished. But there are certain little greedy demons of conscience that require a lot of stilling, and they kept Lowes Parlby awake more than half the night. He kept on repeating to himself, "It's all positively absurd." But the little greedy demons pranced around the bed, and they began to group things into two definite issues. On the one side, the great appearances; on the other, something at the back of it all, something deep, fundamental, something that could only be expressed by one word: truth. If he had really loved Adela, if he weren't so absolutely certain that Sandeman was wrong and he was right, why should he have to say that Wych Street was where it wasn't? "Isn't there, after all," said one of the little demons, "something which makes for greater happiness than success? Confess this, and we'll let you sleep." Perhaps that is one of the most potent weapons the little demons possess. However full our lives may be, we ever long for moments of tranquillity, and conscience holds before our eyes some mirror of an ultimate tranquillity. Lowes Parlby was certainly not himself. The gay, debonair, and brilliant egoist was tortured, and tortured almost beyond control. And it had all apparently risen through the ridiculous discussion about a street. At 3:15 in the morning he arose from his bed with a groan, and going into the other room, he tore the letter to Mr. Sandeman to pieces. 3 weeks later, old Stephen Garrett was lunching with the Lord Chief Justice. They were old friends, and they never found it incumbent to be very conversational. The lunch was an excellent but frugal meal. They both ate slowly and thoughtfully, and their drink was water. It was not till they reached the dessert stage that his lordship indulged in any very informative comment, and then he recounted to Stephen the details of a recent case in which he considered that the presiding judge had, by an unprecedented prolology, misinterpreted the law of evidence. Stephen listened with absorbed attention. He took 2 cobnuts from the silver dish, and turned them over meditatively, without cracking them. When his lordship had completely stated his opinion and peeled a pear, Stephen mumbled, "I have been impressed, very impressed indeed. Even in my own field of limited observation, the opinion of an outsider, you may say. So often it happens. The trouble caused by an affirmation without sufficiently established data. I have seen lives lost, ruin brought about, endless suffering. Only last week, a young man, a brilliant career, almost shattered. People make statements without—" He put the nuts back on the dish, and then, in an apparently irrelevant manner, he said abruptly, "Do you remember Wych Street, my lord?" The Lord Chief Justice grunted. "Wych Street? Of course I do." "Where would you say it was, my lord?" "Why, Here, of course." His lordship took a pencil from his pocket and sketched a plan on the tablecloth. "It used to run from there to here." Stephen adjusted his glasses and carefully examined the plan. He took a long time to do this, and when he had finished, his hand instinctively went towards a breast pocket, where he kept a notebook with little squared pages. Then he stopped and sighed. After all, why argue with the law? The law was like that. An excellent thing, not infallible, of course. Even the plan of the Lord Chief Justice was a quarter of a mile out. But still an excellent, a wonderful thing. He examined the bony knuckles of his hands and yawned slightly. "Do you remember it?" said the Lord Chief Justice. Stephen nodded sagely, and his voice seemed to come from a long way off. "Yes, I remember it, my lord. It was a melancholy little street." End of Story 1.